The mysterious bunker. On a distant planet, far from the bustling cities of Earth, there was nothing but silence. The planet, once filled with life and thriving civilizations, now lay in ruins. The war between the humans and the alien invaders had devastated everything. Buildings, forests, and entire cities had been wiped out in a matter of months. But deep beneath the surface, hidden from the devastation above, was a small bunker. The human who lived there had no idea if he was the last survivor of his kind, or if other humans had escaped to other parts of the galaxy. What he did know was that he had been hiding here for what felt like an eternity, alone and isolated. His food supplies were running low, and the days seemed to stretch endlessly, one after another. His name was Marcus. Once, he had been a soldier, strong and brave, fighting alongside others to defend humanity. Now he was just a man trying to survive. His face had grown thin, and his clothes were torn and worn from months of use. His once pristine uniform was now covered in dirt, and his eyes had lost the spark they once had. He spent his days searching for food and water, keeping track of the days on a small calendar he had marked on the wall. The bunker itself was small but safe. It had been built as a last resort, a hidden place where humans could escape if the worst happened. It had everything he needed to survive for a while, but not much more. The walls were made of cold metal, and the air smelled stale, but it was better than being out there in the open. At least here, he could stay hidden from the alien forces that had wiped out his people. Marcus had always been a man of action. He didn't wait around for help. He made his own fate, but even he knew there was little he could do now. The war was over, and he had lost. The aliens had won. He wasn't even sure why he was still alive. Maybe he was meant to be the last reminder of humanity's fight. But now, survival was his only goal. His food supply was running out, and he had barely any clean water left. The bunker's generator was still running, providing him with light and warmth, but it wouldn't last forever. If he didn't find more food soon, he would have no choice but to leave the bunker and face the dangers outside. One evening, as Marcus sat in the small corner of the bunker, eating the last bit of his canned food, he heard something strange. A soft noise, almost like a whisper, coming from the shadows. He froze. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing there. His heart started to race, and he stood up slowly, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. The noise came again. It wasn't in his head. It was real. Someone, or something, was outside the bunker. His mind raced. Was it the aliens? Were they here to finish him off? Or was it another human? He didn't know who to trust anymore. The war had taught him that people were just as dangerous as the aliens, sometimes even more so. Still, he had no choice but to investigate. Carefully, Marcus moved toward the door that led outside the bunker. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. He gripped the door handle, hesitated for a moment, then pulled it open. The moment the door creaked, he heard something shift in the darkness beyond. The air outside was colder than he expected. He had spent so much time inside, he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be out there. The world beyond the bunker was dark and eerie. Broken pieces of alien ships littered the landscape, twisted metal and smoke rising from the ground. The stars above were clouded, as though the universe itself was mourning the destruction that had taken place. And then he saw her. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, his mind playing tricks on him from the isolation. But no, she was real. A girl, an alien girl, stood in front of him, barely visible in the low light. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, and her long silver hair cascaded down her back. She was thin, but there was strength in her posture. She looked nothing like the alien invaders Marcus had fought during the war. She wasn't wearing any armor or weapons, and her eyes, though bright and alien, held a kind of sadness in them that he couldn't ignore. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him with a look of curiosity. Marcus's hand tightened around the handle of his weapon, unsure if he should raise it in defense. He had no idea who she was or what she wanted, but something about her felt different. She didn't seem hostile. "Who are you?" Marcus asked, his voice rough from days of silence. He had almost forgotten how to speak to another living being. The alien girl didn't answer immediately. She only took a small step forward, her eyes scanning him as though she were searching for something. Her gaze settled on him for a moment. And then she finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I am not your enemy," she said, her words carrying a strange melody to them. "I only wish to help." Marcus blinked, still unsure if he could trust her. "Help?" he asked, his grip on the weapon not loosening. "How? What do you want from me?" The girl shook her head gently. "Nothing. I want to help you survive. We are both alone in this broken world." Marcus stared at her, trying to process what she had said. Could she really be trusted, or was this some kind of trick? After all, she was an alien, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't a threat. "I don't need help," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though doubt gnawed at him. "I can survive on my own." But the girl stepped closer, her expression serious now. "No, you can't. You're running out of food. You'll need help to survive." Marcus hesitated, his mind spinning. What was she offering? What kind of help could an alien possibly give him? But before he could ask any more questions, she did something unexpected. From a small pouch on her waist, she pulled out a flask and offered it to him. The flask was filled with a strange, glowing liquid. "Drink," she said. "It will keep you alive for now. You cannot survive without it." Marcus's eyes widened. He had no choice. He had to decide. Would he trust this alien girl and drink whatever this strange liquid was, or would he turn his back on the only potential help he had left? The silence between them stretched on. An unexpected encounter. Marcus stood in the doorway of the bunker, staring at the alien girl. The flask she offered glowed faintly in the dim light, an eerie, almost ethereal hue. Her eyes locked with his, calm yet intense, as though she could see past all his defenses, all the doubts that clouded his mind. Her presence was both unsettling and strangely comforting, a paradox he couldn't understand. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hand still gripped the weapon at his side. The years of war, the violence, the betrayals, everything had taught him to trust no one. Humanity had fallen because they were too trusting, too quick to make alliances with those who claimed to help. He had seen enough to know that appearances were often deceiving, and the cost of misplaced trust was too high. But the girl was here, offering help. The air between them felt thick with tension. Marcus weighed his options. Could he risk taking the drink from her? Could he afford to trust her? He could already feel the hunger gnawing at his insides, the weakness from days of scarce rations. The last meal he had eaten was days ago, and now he could barely muster the strength to think clearly. His body was starting to give out, and he knew it. She wasn't making any aggressive movements, and she wasn't threatening him in any way. Her body language was open, but guarded, like a person who had learned the harsh lessons of survival. It was clear she wasn't here to harm him. At least not immediately. The real question was, what did she want? What was her true motive? "Why are you here?" Marcus finally asked, his voice hoarse. He spoke the question he had been dying to ask since he first saw her. "Why offer help now? What do you want from me?" The alien girl's gaze softened, but she didn't move. "I told you. I want to help you survive. There is no one else. We are both alone. The world outside is broken, destroyed by the same war that tore us apart." Her voice was gentle but firm, and there was a sadness in her words that tugged at something deep inside him. Her eyes, though alien and foreign, held a depth of emotion he hadn't expected. She wasn't just some cold invader. She was someone who had suffered, someone who had lost just like he had. "Survival isn't enough," Marcus replied. "I don't just want to live. I want to fight. I want to take back what's ours. We've lost everything, but I'll be damned if I just sit here and wait to die." The girl looked down at the flask in her hands, her fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "I understand your pain," she said quietly, "but sometimes survival is all we have left. This world is no longer ours to reclaim. What's gone is gone, but there's still a chance for you, for us, to rebuild." Marcus' eyes flickered with skepticism. Rebuild? On this planet? With what? There's nothing left. The aliens destroyed everything. What's left to fight for? Her eyes met his again, unwavering. There is always something worth fighting for. You may not see it now, but survival, hope, are what make us who we are. Without it, we are nothing. The milk I offer you will help you stay strong. It will give you the energy you need to survive. And with it, we can leave this place and find a new way forward. Marcus swallowed hard. The idea of leaving the bunker, venturing into the unknown, terrified him. The outside world was a wasteland, filled with dangers. Alien forces still patrolled the ruins, looking for survivors to hunt down. There was no safety out there, but the idea of dying alone in this cold, forgotten place, with nothing but memories of a war long over, was worse. The girl's offer seemed too simple, too good to be true. But what other choice did he have? His supplies were running out, and his body was weakening. Finally, he lowered his weapon and took a step forward. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I'll take it, but I'm not trusting you completely. Not yet." The alien girl didn't respond with words. Instead, she held out the flask once more. Without further hesitation, Marcus took it from her hands and brought it to his lips. The liquid inside was cool and smooth, and as he drank, he could feel an immediate rush of energy coursing through his veins. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. A sharp, tingling sensation that spread from his throat to his limbs, revitalizing him in a way he hadn't felt in days. He paused after taking a few swigs, looking down at the flask. There was something strange about it. The glow seemed to pulse, as if alive. It felt different, somehow. The girl watched him closely, her expression unreadable. "It is a gift from my people," she said, as though sensing his confusion. "It has healing properties. It can help you recover from physical exhaustion, and it will sustain you for a while." Marcus nodded slowly, but he was still wary. "How long will this last? What's in it?" "You'll have enough to survive for a few days," she replied. "Long enough to decide what you will do next. But remember, the milk alone cannot solve all your problems. You will need to find other ways to survive. And perhaps you will find something greater than survival." The words echoed in Marcus' mind as he lowered the flask. He could feel the strength returning to his limbs, the hunger easing from his stomach. His thoughts began to clear, and the darkness around him didn't feel as oppressive as before. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus asked again, his voice softer this time, more genuine. "You could have just let me die here. You have no reason to care about me. I'm just one human, and I'm no hero." The alien girl tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. "Because I know what it's like to be alone. I know what it's like to watch everything you've known crumble and fall. And I don't want you to make the same mistake I made. Don't give up too soon. Don't lose hope." Marcus felt a flicker of something within him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but standing here with this alien girl, receiving her help, something stirred inside him. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe they could fight to survive together. "All right," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "You've given me a reason to keep going. For now, I'll trust you." The girl's expression softened. "Trust is a fragile thing, but we don't have time to waste. We need to prepare. The world outside won't wait for us to be ready." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had no idea what the future would hold, or if he could trust her completely. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something, a glimmer of hope. The Alien Girl's Story. The cold, stale air in the bunker seemed to weigh heavily on Marcus as he listened to the alien girl speak. Her words carried a sadness that he couldn't quite understand, yet he felt a strange connection to them. He had spent so long in isolation that any sign of life, any sign of someone who could relate to him, felt like a lifeline. But she wasn't just any survivor. She was an alien, someone who had lived through a different kind of war. Someone who had seen her world fall apart in ways he couldn't even imagine. She sat down across from him, the dim light casting shadows on her pale blue skin. Her eyes, large and dark, flickered with a mixture of memories and pain. Her name, she told him, was Lyra, and her people were called the Varuna. They weren't the same as the invaders who had wiped out humanity, and they weren't like the humans Marcus had fought alongside during the war. The Varuna were an ancient race, peaceful and connected to the natural forces of their world. Their planet, which once flourished with vibrant forests, majestic oceans, and towering cities, had been reduced to ashes in the wake of the war. "I didn't always live in hiding," Lyra began, her voice soft, yet full of emotion. "I had a family once, parents, siblings. We lived in a beautiful city, high in the mountains, surrounded by forests that stretched on for miles. My people, we had no interest in war. We lived in harmony with the planet, nurturing it and protecting it from harm. But everything changed the day the invaders arrived." Marcus could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke of her home, the world she had lost. He could hear the way her words cracked, just slightly, as if every sentence was a reminder of the pain that still haunted her. Her people had been caught in the crossfire of a war that had nothing to do with them. And now, she was all that remained of them. They came in ships, unlike anything I had ever seen. They looked like metal gods, descending from the sky, destroying everything in their path. We had no weapons, no defenses. All we had were our homes and our people, and they were taken from us. Our cities fell in a matter of days. The invaders didn't care who they killed or who they destroyed. They came with the intention of wiping us out completely. Marcus listened in stunned silence. He had heard stories of the war, of the brutal invaders who had decimated entire civilizations, but hearing it from Lyra made it feel all too real. She wasn't just a casualty of the war. She was a survivor, someone who had lived through the devastation, someone who had seen the horrors firsthand. "Why didn't you fight back?" Marcus asked, his voice low, his mind still processing what she was saying. "Why didn't your people resist? You must have had some way to defend yourselves." Lyra looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "We tried. We fought with everything we had. But our weapons were useless against their technology. They destroyed us with ease. I watched my family, my friends, fall one by one. We retreated into the forests, trying to hide from them, but there was no escape. The invaders were relentless. They hunted us like animals." Marcus could feel the weight of her words. He could imagine the desperation, the fear that must have filled her as she ran for her life. He had experienced his own share of battles, of fighting until there was nothing left, but hearing it from Lyra made him feel small. His struggle was nothing compared to what she had gone through. "I managed to escape," Lyra continued, her voice growing quieter. "I found shelter in an ancient cave deep in the mountains. There, I hid for weeks, surviving on what little I could find. Eventually, I found a group of other survivors, small groups of Varuna, who had also managed to escape. But we were few, and the invaders were still out there. I knew it wouldn't be long before they found us." She paused, her eyes clouding over as if the memories were too painful to revisit. Marcus could sense the pain she was feeling, and for the first time since meeting her, he understood. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone who had lost everything. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was simply sharing her truth. "The last time I saw my people was when the invaders found us. They attacked our shelter, and I was the only one who managed to escape. I ran until I could no longer run, until I found myself here, on this broken planet, Alone. Marcus felt the weight of her words settle heavily in his chest. He couldn't imagine the kind of loss she had suffered, the kind of pain she carried with her. For him, the war had been a series of battles, one after another, with the hope that survival would eventually bring peace. But for Lyra, the war had been something more. It had been her entire life, and the price of survival was everything she had known. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've been through so much. Why help me? Why not just keep running, keep hiding? You've already lost so much." Lyra turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything. I know what it's like to feel the weight of survival when you're the last one left. But I also know that survival means something. It means hope. Even when everything else is gone, hope is what keeps you alive. You, Marcus, are the last of your people, and I can't let that be the end of your story." Her words struck him like a bolt of lightning, piercing through the walls he had built around himself. Hope. He had lost it long ago, along with the people he had once fought to protect. But now, sitting here in the cold, dark bunker with this alien girl, something began to shift inside him. He wasn't the last survivor of humanity just because he was alone. He was the last survivor because there was still something worth fighting for. Lyra's story was one of survival, yes, but it was also one of resilience. She had lost everything, yet here she was, offering him the same chance at survival she had fought for. She wasn't just offering him help. She was offering him a reason to keep going, a reason to fight. Marcus took a deep breath, looking at her with newfound understanding. He had spent so much time focusing on his own pain, on the loss of his world, that he had forgotten what it meant to have a purpose beyond survival. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop fighting only for himself and start fighting for something greater. "We're not alone, are we?" Marcus said softly, his voice steady. "There are others. Other survivors. Like you." Lyra nodded slowly, her expression softening. "There are always others. But finding them, helping them, that's what makes the difference. That's what keeps us human. That's what keeps us alive." For the first time since the war, Marcus felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The milk's power. Marcus could feel the strange energy pulsating through his body as the last drop of the glowing liquid left the flask. The sensation was immediate and intense, like an electric current coursing through his veins, sparking life into every cell, every fiber of his being. He had drunk water from rivers, juice from fruits, and even alien substances in his lifetime, but nothing had ever felt like this. This alien milk, it was different. It wasn't just nourishment, it was something more. At first, it was subtle. The fatigue that had clung to him for so long began to lift. His muscles, once stiff and aching from days of hunger and lack of movement, slowly relaxed. His thoughts, which had been sluggish and unfocused, cleared as if a fog had been lifted from his mind. He could feel the blood in his veins flowing more freely, the weight of exhaustion dissolving. For the first time in weeks, he felt alive. He looked up at Lyra, who watched him closely, her gaze intense, studying him. She had offered him the drink, but Marcus had no idea what it really was. Was it a miracle potion? A drug? Or something more? Whatever it was, it had worked. The question now was, what was its true purpose? The girl's eyes softened, as though sensing his confusion. She didn't speak at first, but her expression held an unspoken understanding. The transformation was clear. The drink had done its job, at least for now. "How you feel?" she asked, her voice gentle, yet full of a quiet urgency. Marcus flexed his fingers, feeling the strength returning to his hands. He could lift his arms without the usual ache that had plagued him only moments before. His breathing was deep and steady, and his mind felt sharp, not bogged down by hunger or despair. It was like a switch had been flipped inside him, and the world felt a little less heavy. "It's unbelievable," Marcus replied, his voice filled with awe. He flexed his legs, testing his newfound strength. I feel stronger, more awake. This stuff, this really works. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes flickering with something like relief. Yes, it works. The milk of my people has unique properties. It sustains and heals. It has the power to restore physical strength and mental clarity. But that's not all. It can give you something more, something you may not fully understand yet. Marcus furrowed his brow, trying to make sense of her words. He had seen many things in his time, from the wonders of alien technology to the horrifying brutality of war. But this was different. He had been given power, real, undeniable power, by something as simple as a drink. What more could it give me? Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. I feel great, but I need to know. I need to understand. Lyra's expression became more serious as she leaned forward slightly. The milk isn't just for survival. It can unlock something within you. It can help you adapt, heal wounds, restore strength, even alter how you think and react. The Varuna have always known how to use it, but it's not a cure-all. It's not magic. It's a tool, one that must be used with caution. Marcus looked at her, his mind racing. He had heard of strange abilities before, of alien technologies that could do things humans couldn't even dream of. But this was different. This was something that was connected to life itself, something organic, alive. So, you're saying this milk could change me? He asked slowly, as though testing the weight of the idea. Not just make me stronger, but change how I am. Lyra nodded. Yes. If used too much, it can alter your instincts, your perceptions, your body. It could make you faster, stronger, even more adaptable to new environments. It has the power to enhance what is already inside of you. But it's a delicate balance. If you take too much, you risk losing yourself. You risk becoming something else entirely. The gravity of her words hit Marcus like a slap to the face. He hadn't considered the consequences. He had been so desperate for strength, for a way to survive, that he hadn't thought about what it might cost him. Was he willing to give up his humanity just for a chance at survival? The milk had restored him, yes, but what was he sacrificing in the process? Marcus looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers again, as if expecting something else to happen. His body felt alive with energy, but there was something unsettling about it too. He was more than just restored. He was enhanced. Was this the price of survival? Was it worth it? You're right, Marcus said, his voice tight. I need to be careful. I can't let this control me. I have to keep my head. I can't become some monster. Lyra's expression softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You are not a monster, Marcus. You're a human, just like I am, Varuna. This power, it's not about what it can do to you. It's about what you choose to do with it. That's the difference. Her words were simple, yet they struck a chord deep inside him. She wasn't telling him to fear the power. She was telling him to control it, to use it as a tool, not as a crutch. In that moment, he understood. The milk had given him strength, but it was his choices that would define him. Not the substance, not the alien girl, not the war. It was him. Marcus took a deep breath, letting the reality of his situation sink in. He was no longer the same man he had been before. The war, the isolation, the pain, it had all changed him. But now, for the first time in a long while, he had a chance to take control again, to carve his own path forward. Lyra seemed to read his thoughts, her eyes warm with understanding. You will find your way, Marcus, but be aware, this strength, it will draw attention. There will be those who seek to use you. You will be hunted. Marcus nodded, the weight of her warning settling in his chest. He wasn't naive. He had known from the moment he stepped out of the bunker that the world had changed. But now, with this newfound power, he was more than just a survivor. He was a potential weapon, a tool of destruction, if left unchecked. "I'm ready," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "I won't let anyone use me. I'll use this power to survive, on my own terms." Lyra gave him a small, knowing smile. "That's all any of us can do. Survive on our own terms. But you must remember, you are not alone anymore. You have me. And together, we can survive what comes next." The room fell into a heavy silence, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus didn't feel alone. He had been given the strength to move forward, not just physically, but emotionally. He could feel the bond between him and Lyra growing stronger, forged in the fires of survival. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He would face it head-on, with the strength to survive and the will to fight. And perhaps in the end, he would learn to control the power he had been given. The journey was just beginning. The growing connection. The days after the strange encounter with Lyra passed in a blur of newfound energy and cautious optimism. Marcus had never imagined that he would form any kind of connection in a world so fractured and broken. But somehow, in the wake of the alien invasion, the war, and the isolation that had consumed him, Lyra had become more than just a stranger. She had become something akin to a companion. Someone who, like him, had seen the darkest sides of the universe and survived. Their bond was unspoken at first. They shared the same survival instinct, the same need for sustenance. But there was something more, something deeper that began to form as they spent more time together. They were both survivors, both of them carrying the weight of their losses, but neither of them willing to give in to despair. Lyra never spoke much about her people, but every now and then she would mention a memory, a flicker of her past life before the war, before the destruction. The way she described her homeworld was so vivid, so full of life, that Marcus couldn't help but imagine it. She spoke of vast forests, the kind that stretched for miles, full of trees that seemed to touch the sky. She spoke of oceans that shimmered under twin moons, and cities that glittered in the dark, where the Varuna had lived in peace, untouched by the violence that had consumed the rest of the galaxy. "I remember the way the sun felt on my skin," Lyra would say, her voice soft and distant. "It was warm, not too hot. The air was always fresh, and the wind smelled of pine and earth. We didn't have to fight. We lived in balance." Marcus would listen to her, his mind drifting to his own world, his own memories of a time before the war had torn everything apart. He had once believed that humanity could have the same kind of balance, that they could coexist peacefully with the other species in the galaxy. But that dream had shattered when the war began. The reality was stark. Peace was fragile, and it often slipped through your fingers the moment you stopped fighting for it. But as the days passed, Marcus began to see something else in Lyra's eyes, something beyond the pain of her past. There was strength in her, a resilience that was undeniable. She wasn't broken like many of the survivors he had encountered. She was driven by something greater. Hope, perhaps. But more than that, she had a purpose. She had a reason to keep going. In return, Marcus began to share his own story, the details of the war, his life before all this madness started. It wasn't easy, but it felt different telling Lyra. He wasn't just recounting the pain of losing everything. He was finally opening up to someone who understood loss on the same level. And in that shared understanding, they both began to heal, piece by piece. "I fought in the war," Marcus would say, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of years of fighting. "I thought we could win. I thought we could hold our ground. But in the end, it was never about winning. It was about surviving. And even then, it felt like we lost." Lyra would nod quietly, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a knowing that matched his own. She, too, had fought to survive, only to watch everything she loved burn away. "I know what it feels like to lose everything," she would reply softly, her voice like a quiet lullaby, though there was nothing soft about her experiences. "But you can't let that define you. Survival is not the end. It's just the beginning. The beginning of something new, You just have to decide what you want that new beginning to be. Marcus didn't have an immediate answer to her words, but they sat with him, heavy and persistent. What was the future? What did it look like after everything had been taken away? Was there any hope of reclaiming anything, or was the only choice left to start from scratch? In the mornings, they would work together to gather supplies, food, water, anything they could find. The outside world, though still a dangerous wasteland, had its share of resources: alien plants, strange fruits, and even wildlife that had survived the chaos of the war provided sustenance. They never ventured too far from the bunker, but they grew more efficient with every trip. Lyra, who knew more about the planet's ecosystem, took the lead in finding the safest routes and the most useful resources. But it wasn't just the physical tasks that bound them. It was the quiet moments between the work, the times when the world fell silent, and they found themselves sitting side by side in the bunker, just listening to the hum of the air supply and the occasional distant rumble of alien ships overhead. It was in those moments that they began to understand each other more fully. One evening, after a long day of gathering supplies, Lyra spoke to Marcus again, her tone more serious than usual. "We need to talk about what comes next," she said, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of concern and determination. "The war is over, but the galaxy hasn't forgotten. There are others out there, people who will try to take what we have, people who want to control everything. We can't stay hidden forever. We have to move." Marcus turned to face her, his expression serious. He had been waiting for this conversation. He had been wondering when they would talk about what came after survival. When would they stop running and start fighting? "I know," he said, his voice steady. "I've been thinking the same thing. But where do we go? The galaxy's a big place, and I don't know what's out there anymore. I don't know who we can trust. I don't even know if there's anyone left." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing together in a tight line. "There are others, other survivors. I know that for a fact. We just have to find them. And when we do, we have to be ready to help them. We have to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, we can stop what happened to us from happening again." The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Rebuilding. The idea sounded impossible, even foolish. How could they rebuild anything after all that had been destroyed? But there was a fire in Lyra's eyes, and in that fire, Marcus saw something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time: a purpose, a reason to keep going. "What do we do first?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Lyra stood up, walking to the small window that overlooked the barren landscape. "We survive. We gather more supplies. And then we move. Together, we can find others. We can make a difference." Marcus stood up too, his eyes following her every movement. For the first time in ages, he felt a spark of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. It wasn't much, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was something. "All right," he said, nodding. "We'll do it. We'll rebuild. Together." And in that moment, as they stood side by side in the dim light of the bunker, a new chapter began for both of them. It was a chapter of survival, yes, but more than that, it was a chapter of connection, of finding a reason to fight, not just for themselves, but for something bigger, something that might one day grow into something worth saving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate land outside, Marcus and Lyra knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that, in itself, was enough to keep them moving forward. The ultimate sacrifice. The days that followed were filled with preparation and strategy. Marcus and Lyra knew that survival in this broken world wasn't enough. They had food and water, a safe shelter, and a plan to find other survivors, but the looming threat of alien forces still hung over them like a dark cloud. It wasn't enough to simply survive anymore. They needed to protect themselves, to ensure that the tragedy of their past would not be repeated. The thought of fighting seemed daunting, especially with only the two of them. But they knew one thing with certainty. The aliens who had destroyed Lyra's world weren't done. They would come looking for them. There were always more of them. And when they did, Marcus and Lyra would have to be ready. The alien milk, which had once healed Marcus and given him strength, now served as a reminder of the delicate balance they walked. They had to rely on it, but they couldn't become dependent on it. They couldn't allow themselves to be changed by it, or they risked losing everything, who they were and why they fought. In the evenings, after scavenging and securing supplies, Lyra would sit with Marcus and discuss their next steps. The bunker had been their home for a time, a sanctuary from the outside world, but they couldn't remain hidden forever. They had already drawn attention by simply surviving, and the aliens would eventually find them. They would need to move soon. But the world outside was a wasteland. Alien forces roamed the ruins, searching for any trace of life to exterminate. The idea of leaving the bunker, even with their strength, was terrifying. Yet staying meant eventual death. Marcus knew they couldn't afford to wait. They had to act. The first part of their plan was to gather information. They needed to know where the alien forces were stationed, what resources they had, and whether there were any safe zones left on the planet. Lyra, with her knowledge of the terrain and the remnants of her people's intelligence network, had an idea of where they might start their search. That's when Marcus felt the first real shift in the air, a shift that made his instincts scream. "They're coming," Lyra whispered one evening, her voice taut with fear and determination. Her eyes glinted in the dim light of the bunker, her sharp senses attuned to something Marcus couldn't yet perceive. He stood up immediately, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon he had kept close ever since he'd set foot on this planet. "How do you know?" Lyra was already at the control panel of the bunker, scanning for signs of movement. "I can sense their ships. They're out there. They've been patrolling the region for days, but now they're closer. They're hunting for us." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the situation crashed over him. They were close, closer than he'd ever imagined. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if it would be better to run, to find another place to hide. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option. Hiding would only prolong the inevitable. He had to face them. They had to face them together. Lyra's voice broke through his thoughts. "We need to make a choice, Marcus. We can either stay and wait for them to come to us, or we can take the fight to them. But we need to move fast." The decision was clear. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about making a stand. Marcus had spent so much time in hiding, so much time running, that the idea of fighting back, of taking control again, felt like a distant dream. But now, standing at the edge of the unknown with Lyra, he realized that this was his only chance to reclaim some of what had been lost. "We fight," he said, his voice steady, even as the weight of his decision pressed down on him. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with the same resolve. "I've known you were ready for this moment, Marcus. But it's going to cost us." The words hit harder than he anticipated. There was no easy way to win this battle. They would need to confront the aliens head-on. They would need to strike before the aliens found them first. But the price of victory, Lyra knew, was steep. "We can't do this without making sacrifices," she said, her voice almost a whisper now. "If we're going to fight, we need to make sure we're not caught off guard. We need to move quickly, but we also need to leave no trace behind. The milk you drank, your strength, will help, but it will also make us targets. We have to stay one step ahead of them." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. They packed their supplies and mapped out a route to the nearest alien outpost. Marcus couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach as he realized what this meant. They were going into enemy territory, fully aware that their chances of survival were slim. But Lyra had faith in him. She had seen his strength, and she had come to trust him in a way that went beyond survival. They were partners now, fighting for a cause that went beyond themselves. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore," Lyra said one night, her voice low but full of conviction. "We're fighting for everything we've lost. For all the people who didn't survive. We have to keep fighting, Marcus. It's the only way forward. The weight of her words stayed with him as they moved out of the bunker, heading into the alien-infested wasteland. It was the beginning of their final stand. But as they journeyed through the ruins, Marcus couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. They were too exposed, too vulnerable. The terrain was treacherous, the air thick with tension. The feeling of being hunted was ever present. By the time they reached the outskirts of the alien outpost, Marcus knew that a decision had to be made, one that would change everything. "Lyra," he said, his voice heavy with the truth he had been avoiding. "You need to leave. You need to go. If I don't make it back, you have to survive. You've already lost so much. You can't risk losing everything again." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, Marcus saw her hesitate. It was a brief moment, but it was enough. He could see the weight of his words settling in. She understood. "I'm not leaving you, Marcus," Lyra said firmly. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." But Marcus knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ensuring that one of them made it out. One of them had to live to carry on the fight. One of them had to be the hope that remained after the battle was over. "I'm the one who's going to fight," Marcus said, his voice filled with finality. "I'll draw their attention, buy you the time you need, but you have to make sure you get away. Promise me you'll survive. Promise me you'll find the others." Tears welled in Lyra's eyes, but she nodded. She understood the sacrifice Marcus was willing to make. It was a decision that would cost him everything, but it was the only chance they had. As Marcus turned to face the enemy forces, he knew that this was his last stand. The fight would be brutal, and the cost would be high. But it was the only way to ensure that hope would survive. The ultimate sacrifice had been made. Now, all that was left was the battle for their future. The final stand. The air was thick with tension. The silence before the storm almost unbearable. Marcus stood alone at the edge of the alien outpost, his breath shallow and quick, his senses heightened. The night was quiet, save for the occasional whir of distant alien ships patrolling the skies. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "You're not getting rid of me that easily." He had told her to run, to survive, but she refused to abandon him. She had chosen to stay by his side, even though she knew the dangers that lay ahead. That bond, however fragile, was now his strength. The thought of her fierce determination to keep fighting despite everything she had lost, fueled him. But the battle wasn't going to be easy. Marcus knew the aliens had seen them coming. They had left enough clues for their enemies to follow, enough noise, enough disruption in the terrain. The trap was set. They had walked right into it. Now, there was no turning back. Marcus took a deep breath and looked over at Lyra, who stood just behind him, her face grim but resolute. She had insisted on staying close, insisting that they would face this together. He wanted to argue, to push her away to safety, but he couldn't. She had been through too much to be told to run again. The alien outpost loomed before them, a dark and intimidating structure built into the side of a jagged cliff. The walls were smooth, metallic, and glistened in the dim light of the dying stars above. It was as though the entire building was alive, a mechanical beast, waiting for them to make the first move. Marcus could feel the eyes of the aliens upon him, even if they didn't know exactly where he was. They would know soon. "This is it," Marcus said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "We make our stand here." Lyra's eyes locked onto his, her gaze steady. "We do what we must." There was no more time for plans, no more time for second guesses. It was now or never. The first shot came from nowhere. A burst of energy, crackling through the air, just inches from Marcus' shoulder. He barely had time to react, ducking behind a pile of broken debris. But the aliens were quick. They had spotted them. It was a coordinated strike, an ambush. Marcus's heart raced, but his training kicked in. He rolled to the side, pulling Lyra down with him as the alien forces began to swarm the area. They weren't alone anymore. Marcus had done his best to draw their attention, but now they were in the thick of it. The stakes had escalated. He grabbed his weapon, feeling the weight of it in his hand as he lined up the first shot. The exchange of gunfire was deafening. Energy blasts zipped past them, burning through the air. Marcus shot back, hitting one of the alien soldiers square in the chest. The alien crumpled, its body falling to the ground with a sickening thud. But there was no time to dwell on that victory. More were coming, and they were coming fast. "Lyra," Marcus shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Move to the east flank. Get behind cover." She nodded, moving with the precision of someone who had fought before. The two of them were a unit, working together like they had been fighting side by side for years. Their connection had deepened, and now it was the key to their survival. But Marcus knew they couldn't hold out forever. They were outnumbered, and while the alien forces weren't invincible, they had advanced technology, advanced tactics. He could hear the roar of their ships overhead, the distant hum of their engines closing in. Soon, they would be surrounded. They would be trapped. And then, the worst possible thing happened. Marcus heard a loud crack as one of the energy blasts hit a nearby rock, sending a chunk of debris flying. The explosion sent him reeling, and he lost his footing. He hit the ground hard, his weapon slipping from his grasp. For a split second, everything went still. The chaos around him seemed to fade, and all he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. His vision blurred, his limbs were heavy, and for a moment, he couldn't move. He had taken hits before. Scrapes, bruises, nothing too serious. But this time, it was different. The pain was deep. A surge of fear gripped him, realizing that he might not be able to get back up. And then he heard her voice. "Marcus." Lyra cried, her voice urgent, filled with panic. "Stay with me. You have to stay with me." She rushed to his side, helping him sit up, her hands shaking as she applied pressure to his side, where a deep wound had opened. Blood dripped from the gash, staining his uniform and the ground beneath him. But it wasn't the wound that terrified him. It was the sound of the aliens closing in. "Lyra, you have to go," he gasped, his breath ragged. "You can't stay here. Get to safety." But Lyra wasn't listening. She wasn't going to leave him behind. Not now. Not ever. "I'm not leaving you," she snapped, her eyes burning with fury and fear. "You think you can die here, and I'll just walk away. We fight together. We survive together." Her words, though filled with emotion, were a reminder of the promise they had made to each other, to survive. They had already made so many sacrifices, but this was it. This was their last chance. If they didn't stop the aliens here, they wouldn't just lose themselves. They would lose everything they had fought for. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him as Lyra hoisted him up, her strength surprising him. They were in this together, and no matter the cost, they would fight until the end. With a final surge of strength, Marcus grabbed his weapon once more, determined not to let the alien forces win. They were so close. He could feel them closing in, hear the sounds of their boots hitting the ground, their voices calling to each other in a language he didn't understand. But it didn't matter. He wasn't going to let them take over. Not again. "I'll cover you," he whispered to Lyra, his voice low, strained but determined. She nodded, her face set in determination. They had no choice but to fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything. She took a deep breath, readying herself to push forward. They fought side by side, their movements synchronized, covering each other's backs. Lyra would fire from one side, Marcus from another, each of them working in perfect harmony, knowing the consequences of failure. But despite their best efforts, the aliens were relentless. Then, just as the alien forces closed in, Marcus saw a glimmer of hope. The ground shook as a loud explosion erupted in the distance. It wasn't the sound of their weapons. It was something bigger. Lyra's eyes widened as she turned toward him, her face pale. "They're not the only ones here," Marcus whispered, realizing at that moment that reinforcements had arrived. The sound of more explosions followed, distant but unmistakable. There was something bigger at play, and it was on their side. But at what cost? With the help of the reinforcements, the battle turned in their favor. The aliens faltered, their forces beginning to retreat, but not before a final confrontation. Marcus and Lyra pushed forward, forcing the alien forces into a retreat, but it was only after a brutal and exhausting struggle. As the last alien soldier fell, the sounds of battle began to die down. And in the silence, Marcus knew that he had made it through, not just for himself, but for everything they had hoped for.